Strategies to reduce risk. Let's begin. I'd like you to imagine that you and I are both in charge of this network right here, and everything is going absolutely great until one day when we discover that there's a security vulnerability or some new security flaw that's discovered on an operating system that we are currently running. Let's say it's on this server right here. And as we know, a vulnerability on a system has an increased likelihood of being taken advantage of compared to if that vulnerability didn't exist. So of course, one of the things we'd want to have done is we'd want to have that system updated to remove the vulnerability. Now, anytime that there's a change on our network, just the change itself is introducing risk. And the goal of having a formal change management procedure is simple, and that is to reduce the risk of a change. So for example, right here, when we perform that update to that critical business service that we're providing, we want to make sure we follow a set of procedures that are well thought out in advance to help reduce risk during that change. Now, something that I find very interesting in a production environment is that the people at the very top, for example, management, including senior management, they are very, very concerned about change control processes and procedures being followed because they want to make sure they are reducing the risk. But at the other end of the spectrum, we often have technicians. And what I've seen is that the technicians are often focused on, hey, let's just get the job done as far as the nuts and bolts of that change. And they are less concerned about the actual change control process. And that's just an observation that I've seen over the many years that I've dealt with networks and systems. And change control or change management is a management control. It's an administrative control. And the way we force the technicians to abide by it is we make sure that they know that their jobs depend on them following the correct procedures. The other thing we can do is we can also use technical controls so that a technician would not have the ability to implement the update until all of the steps have been followed in the change control process. So one of the questions that we might ask is, okay, Keith, what exactly are these big important steps in a change control process? And I would say one of the big ones would be written approval. So for example, there's a change request that comes in, it's evaluated, the technical details of that change are looked at, and then somebody at the management level needs to go ahead and sign off that, okay, this is okay. Go ahead and proceed. Now, when management signs off, giving their written approval, it's not just from an email saying, okay, we want to make this change, can we do it? It's very likely that a lot of little details have to be itemized and all done before we're going to get written approval. For example, have we tested the new solution? If there's an update of a driver or an operating system or an application, have we tested it to make sure it's going to work? As well as, does this new update maintain our security controls that are in place? I mean, if we have an update and it removes a whole bunch of our security, obviously that wouldn't be allowed as an update to a secure system. Do we have a backup of the old system that we are going to have before we update to the new one? Do we have a time frame or a schedule when we would be doing this update? And that schedule of downtime or how the system is going to be affected would also need to be communicated to the right user community so they would be aware of that. For example, last night I was going up to a system and I had a banner message saying this system will not be available till 5 a.m. the next morning. And that was perfectly cool because they did give me some messages earlier saying, hey, we're scheduling some downtime and this window of midnight to 5 a.m., the system will not be available on this specific day. Another big part of our change control process would be a back out plan. For example, let's say we do the update and once it's installed, it doesn't go well. What's our back out plan to restore it to the way it previously was? And we need to have that built into our time frame. Let's say, for example, we have 3 hours scheduled for an update. And let's say we also know that if everything goes terribly, horribly wrong with that update, it's going to take 1 hour to restore to the way it was before we got there for the change. Well, that means inside of our change window, once we get 2 hours in, we have to basically cut it off and say, you know what, we have to restore this and get back to the way it was before, or else we'll be outside of our change control window. So we need to have a specific plan as part of change control. If some type of a system update or upgrade or patch fails, how do we get back exactly specifically what are we going to do? And the goal is to have everything planned for, so we don't have to think on the fly of, oh my goodness, this isn't working like we thought it would. What do? We have a specific plan in place and we execute that plan. So let's say, for example, we've done all of our legwork needed in change control. We tested, we did a backup, we scheduled the installation, we have a concrete backout plan if it doesn't go well. The last steps would be to go ahead and do the install of the update. And a really important piece of this is that if the install requires a reboot, we definitely want to make sure we have the capacity to reboot that system as well. And not all upgrades or updates or patches require a reboot, but that would be part of our process to identify exactly what's required and then do what's required. And then after the install and a reboot, if it's needed, we'd also want to do our testing just to validate that everything actually works as it's supposed to. We might want to also test our security controls to make sure they're still in place. And then the last step would be to monitor and really keep a close eye on it, especially in the first few hours that it's up, just to make sure that everything is operating normally. So in a production environment, if our change control window was like 1 a.m. to 6 a.m., and it was all done and we thought it was all correct, starting at 6 a.m., if we have customers that are going to be getting on at 8 a.m., we want to make sure that beginning at 6 a.m. and as those people trickle in and start using the system, that we have the right people looking at the system as far as a monitoring perspective in case there's any hiccups or problems, so we can immediately identify those if they do show up and address them if they do come up. And the intention is, with this really thorough change management process, the goal is to not have any negative security impact as a result of our patch, update, or upgrade. And the whole goal of that, again, is to reduce the risk when performing an update to any critical system that we have in our environment. And the software change control is likely to be more detailed because there's more things involved. For example, with software, we have developers that are working on software. Maybe it's an in-house application. So they create the software. And before that software, for example, gets promoted from version 2.0 to the new version 3.0, there's going to be several steps in the interim before we push that out to the server to verify the code as it's being developed and created to make sure that it's secure, as well as functional for the users. Now, one of the other management type of controls or administrative controls we talked about in an earlier nugget was separation of duties. And that would also apply here if we're rolling out a new version of software as an application on our servers. For example, let's say that Bob really gets around, doesn't he? Let's say that Bob is the developer of this software. So he's been working for weeks or months on this new code. It's gone through all the software development process that it needs to. And let's say it's ready to be installed. It is not going to be Bob that we're going to give access to actually do the update. As an example, we might have Lois, who's the administrator, who, with the correct change control process that she's following, will take the version 3.0 code and do the update following her change control for that update. But it won't be Bob with the permissions to actually promote the latest and greatest version of the software to our production system. And that helps prevent Bob, for example, as a developer, bypassing any steps or doing anything malicious as the code that he created gets put onto our production system. So the change management process would not allow for a developer like Bob to have direct access to do updates by himself to the production system. When I think about incident management, I think of the Boy Scouts of America and their motto, which is be prepared. And that's because when an incident occurs, some security breach, some attack that happens against our network, something really, really negative, it's not really a question of if an event or incident is going to occur, it's really a question of when. So when that incident happens, they'll have a plan. For example, if incident X occurs, then I'm going to do 1, 2, and 3 as far as steps. And see the benefit of that? You don't have to actually make a decision when the event arises or when the incident shows up. And that's why a huge aspect of incident management is about preparing in advance of exactly what steps we're going to follow. And then when the event occurs, all we have to do is execute to do those exact steps. And that's going to help our senior management be ready for when those events do come up. So on this server, for example, let's say some security breach has been discovered. Automatically, our incident management policy will kick in and we'll simply start following the steps. Now, incidents come in all different sizes. Let's say that Bob, for example, is sitting at his desk and he gets a phone call. And that incoming phone call that Bob is getting is from somebody that is malicious. And let's say, as an example, that Bob has access to some documents at the company. And maybe the malicious caller says this, hey, Bob, I don't know whether or not you have access to this information. We'll call it info ABC. Maybe some confidential information that's being held at the company. Maybe some company secrets that they maintain. And the malicious caller says, I don't know if you have access to that information or not. But if that information showed up somehow on this FTP server at this address within the next 24 hours, we could go ahead and give you access to an account with $50,000 in it. Now that would be an example of an incident. Somebody is trying to steal information from our company. Now what should Bob do about that? Now as we think about that, what should Bob do? The second that Bob gets that call, Bob should go ahead and say, "Woo, I've had security awareness training. I know that this is an incident and I'm going to follow the incident handling policy." And again, if it's been planned out in advance, Bob doesn't really have to think about it because he's had security awareness training. He knows that he should go ahead and contact the help desk if that's the policy. Maybe the policy says, go ahead and contact the incident management team at this email address or this phone number. And so Bob, whenever those events happen, he simply acts on what that policy is. And that's an example of an incident management policy kicking in the moment an incident is discovered. In this case, it would be preemptive because the attacker hasn't stolen the information yet, but there is an attempt to steal that information. Another strategy that we can use to help mitigate risk is to use a audit process that periodically and systematically is going to go through and take a look at things such as, okay, what are Bob's rights? He's an employee, he has a valid account. What rights does he have access to? What groups is Bob a member of? Because privilege creep, as we've discussed in a previous video, is so easy to happen if Bob is in role number 1 for, let's say, 6 months, and then he gets moved to role number 2 for 6 months, and then maybe role number 3 for another 6 months. And as he's moving from role to role, if somebody doesn't specifically go back and remove his rights from his previous role, it's very easy for Bob to accumulate the collective rights of all 3 roles, and then we're not following the rule of least privilege, where Bob is supposed to have only enough rights to do Bob's job and not any more. So this review process also can be referred to as auditing, can be used to help mitigate or reduce the risk of privilege creep, as well as verify that the rule of least privilege, or at least the concept of not giving Bob more rights than he needs, is being followed. Another very interesting phenomenon that we might find as we do a review of our user accounts is we might find some user accounts like Sam or Larry or Karen that haven't been accessed, for example, in 3 to 4 months. Now that could be from turnover. For example, these may have been employees in the past, which are no longer employees and their accounts are still sitting there. Or we might have contractors. A contractor comes in, they're going to need certain rights for 3 or 4 months or 3 or 4 weeks. And then after they leave, due to our own error in not handling it correctly, we simply leave the account open. So here are some good strategies. We could, for example, every 3 months run a script across our user database looking for anyone who hasn't logged in the last 45 days. That would help identify those accounts. The other thing we could do is we could automate the disabling of an account. For example, let's say that Ben is a contractor. He needs 3 weeks of access. No problem. When we set up Ben's account, we set up the account to automatically disable after 3 weeks. And some people might say, well, Keith, what if Ben needs to extend a week? He's going to have a problem. Well, Ben logs on after 3 weeks or tries to. He can't log on. He'll go ahead and call the help desk or call the administrator, who, then verifying what really is happening, can go ahead and extend it for another week or 2. But automating the process of disabling accounts after a period of time when you know they shouldn't be needed after that time is a great mechanism. That way we don't have to manually come back in 3 weeks and disable it. Also, if we're doing our periodic reviews and we're doing our searches for seeing the last time somebody logged in, one of those accounts that should come up is, okay, here's Ben, hasn't logged in for 4 months. The account is disabled, so there's not a security issue there. And then if we want to, we can go ahead and clean up that account and remove it. In many cases, it's better to disable account, especially if you have rollover. Larry was working for the company, now he's not. We disable the account manually in case we need to go back and take a look at any of the specifics. Then after some period of time, maybe 6 months or a year or whatever the policy is at your company, after we're sure we don't need any of the other information regarding Larry's account, we can go ahead and delete it. And that would include accounts like Ben, the contractors as well. He needs it for 3 weeks. We set up the account. It automatically disables after a period of time. Then after we verify that it's disabled and we don't need it anymore, we'd simply delete that account. So you and I might ask, what is the negative impact if we don't automatically disable accounts or we don't remove and disable accounts that are no longer in use? The reality is if we don't delete those unused accounts, especially if we don't disable those unused accounts, we are opening ourselves up to additional risk, the additional possibility that someone who is unauthorized could connect to our network and compromise CIA. Any one of those. by stealing data, by changing data, or possibly deleting data or causing a denial of service attack against us, which would affect availability. And the key element to help us mitigate that risk is to put those controls in place, first of all, to automate the automatic disabling of accounts, and then every 3 months or 6 months, going through and reviewing user accounts, looking for too many privileges, go through the accounts, looking for which ones haven't logged in, and then making sure we get out our broom and clean that stuff up. Delete the old accounts that don't need to be there, trim back the permissions on accounts that don't need them, and when we do that, we'd also want to document what we've done and also improve as we go. An example would be, let's say we do an audit of our database of users and we see there's 200 accounts that haven't been logged into for 6 months. So what do? Well, we fix the problem immediately for deleting the accounts that aren't used. And then secondly, we start looking at automating the automatic disabling or possibly automatic scanning on a more frequent basis for accounts that haven't logged in over 30 days. So that we can keep more on top of this process and help limit the risk of attack to our systems. Another very critical risk that many companies face is the risk of leaking out PII, which stands for Personally Identifiable Information. For example, in the US, we have something called a social security number, or a driver's license number, or a credit card number. And if a company is housing that, we absolutely want to be very careful about leaking or losing that information out to the wild. So what are some methods we could use to help mitigate the risk of losing that information? Well, one thing is if we're storing that data on a server, for example on a database on that server, we could encrypt it. So if somebody physically stole that server and the disks are encrypted or the databases are encrypted on that disk, in either case, someone stealing the physical disk without the keys to unlock that information wouldn't be able to access that information. Now on a physical disk, let's say that represents one physical disk. If we encrypt the entire disk, everything on that disk, whether there's databases or music files or individual information, whatever it is, somebody who steals the physical disk, if it's encrypted and they don't have the keys to unlock it, they won't be able to make sense of any of that data. Now on the other hand, if we have a disk which is not encrypted, but we have individual files on that disk, and those individual files are encrypted, if those files are copied to some other location, guess what? If they're encrypted here and we copy them over here, or some hacker steals the files, they're still encrypted. In either case, one of the concepts of helping to mitigate risk regarding personal identifiable information is to encrypt that data as it's stored or transmitted on our networks. Now, what about Bob? Often our weakest link in any environment is the end users themselves. Let's say Bob is bringing up a record regarding some individual. We'll call him John. And that has his social security number, his driver's license, his date of birth, and let's say also his credit card number for that customer named John. Now, because Bob is looking at that on his screen, what could Bob do? Well, Bob could, write it out on a piece of paper, or if the computer that Bob is on is not preventing him from doing some type of a copy-paste, he might be able to move it over that way. But in either case, Bob definitely is looking at that information and has access to it. What if Bob, who turns to the dark side, decides that he is going to sell John's personal information? What's preventing Bob from, for example, emailing it? So we have some attacker on the outside that Bob is in cohorts with, and Bob is going to take that information and simply email it over to the attacker. As a company, one of the steps that you and I could do to help mitigate that risk of that information leaving the PII, leaving our network illegally, is to do something called DLP. Now, DLP stands for Data Loss Prevention. To help reduce the risk of PII, which of course is personally identifiable information, from leaving our network maliciously or accidentally. And one method for doing that, we may have a device. For example, this gateway may be doing multiple things, including, besides Layer 7 application aware inspection for malware and so forth, it can also be providing a data loss prevention service. So it's actually scanning all that traffic that's going out. It's looking at instant messenger, it's looking at email, and what it's looking for specifically in data loss prevention, it's looking for social security numbers perhaps, or credit card numbers, or other types of information that would be harmful to the company if we lost or leaked or sent out to the wild. So these data loss prevention controls that we put in place, this would be an example of a technical control that we put on this device right here, would be an attempt at preventing an employee like Bob from emailing unencrypted information out to an attacker. And it doesn't even have to be out to an attacker. What Bob could do is he could email it to his own email address that he uses at home, for example, something that he can access from the outside. In either case, we don't want that personally identifiable information or any other company sensitive information to leave the protection of our secured network and be sitting in plain text on anybody's email that can be accessed from anywhere in the world. And when we talk about the data that's moving, it doesn't have to be just instant messenger or email. It can be pretty much anything that's not encrypted that we can analyze, which includes HTTP traffic or FTP traffic, anything that's not encrypted. Now the challenge that occurs is this: if Bob takes that sensitive information and he uses his own encryption program on it, and there's lots of them that can be run, if Bob takes that data and encrypts it. For example, let's say that Bob is a music lover, so he's got a whole bunch of MP3 files. Now what Bob could do very easily with a steganography program is he could take his MP3 file, he could take John's sensitive information, and he could actually encode it within that MP3 file. So then, anybody looking at the second MP3 file, the same thing works for an image file as well. You'd have two files. Let's call this 1MP3 and 2.mp3. If you played either one, they still function as a music file, or if it's a picture, it still functions as a picture. And the second one's going to be a little bigger because it has encoded in it some additional information. For example, John's personally identifiable information. So now if Bob takes that MP3 file, the one with John's data in it, and Bob puts it either on the cloud in a Dropbox, or he emails that file to himself or somewhere else, someone just looking at that file isn't going to know, hey, there's sensitive data encrypted inside of this MP3 file as a carrier. But Bob, knowing the actual program that he used and the keys he used to encrypt that data, would then have the ability to go ahead and decrypt that and extract that sensitive information wherever he has access to that file. So unfortunately, even with a data loss prevention inline system looking at data going back and forth, if Bob is emailing this MP3 file and it has encrypted inside of it John's personal information, even the best DLP systems are not going to, without the proper keys that Bob used to lock up that data, a DLP system will not be able to identify the sensitive information because it's not going to see that MP3 file as any of this sensitive information. Normally when I talk about steganography, for people when they see that the first time, they think, wow, that's really, really cool. If you'd like to see more information on that, I did a 10-minute demo, and you can find it by just doing a Google search of Keith Barker steganography, and it's a demonstration of using OpenPuff. It's about 10 minutes, and so I thought what I would do is instead of taking 10 minutes right here for that demo, for those of you who are interested, go ahead and just Google Keith Barker steganography, and one of the first links is going to have Keith Barker doing the demo on OpenPuff, and that's the one you want to go ahead and take a look at. And that'll walk you step by step through the encryption and decryption process using an open source product called OpenPuff. Now with data loss prevention, a big part of it is the end users themselves, because they are looking at the data on the screens of the computers they're using. So if there's some kind of malware sitting at Bob's computer that's, collecting this information, or if Bob is malicious and is trying to copy that information, oftentimes on that end user computer, we'll use something called endpoint protection on that endpoint device to help implement data loss prevention. And it's very likely if Bob is looking at sensitive information, he's going to have no ability from a cut and paste perspective of moving that data around. Those are some technical controls that we would implement on that computer, as well as having antivirus, anti-malware, and having those consistently being updated if the processing is being done at this device. Now it's also quite possible that this computer right here is just a terminal that's actually reflecting what's happening on a virtual machine somewhere, or on a bigger system like a mini computer or mainframe that's actually doing the crunching. And that endpoint protection would primarily apply to protecting the data while it's in use or being viewed or processed. And then for protecting the data as it sits on a file system, we would use encryption for protecting it at rest. Because really, when you think about data, we have two types of data. We have data in motion that's being moved across networks and being viewed and processed and worked with. And we have data at rest, which is physically sitting on some storage media. And the concept and techniques and tools for data loss prevention would still be relevant even if we do, for example, software as a service. And if we're running some application in the cloud, we would still use data loss prevention techniques to help mitigate or reduce the risk of losing sensitive, important information. And if we don't apply those data loss prevention mechanisms, whether we're on physical hardware or running applications from the cloud, the risk of losing the data and the financial consequences of losing that data are too great for a company to accept without putting in the correct controls to mitigate that risk. One of the other concerns that I've seen in many companies are flash drives. They continue to go down in price. The capacity goes up and the price goes down, and they're so convenient. You can stick one in the computer and use it as a removable media for storage. And without any type of technical controls, you can write to them or read from them. And both of those are problems in most networks. For example, Bob. If Bob has sensitive information on his computer and his personal computer is all encrypted, the hard drive, what happens if he puts in a flash drive and then records information unencrypted on the flash drive? That flash drive is removed and taken who knows where. That's a security risk. So as part of data loss prevention, we very may well have a policy that says no USB drives whatsoever. So we have technical controls that we could implement on those end user computers that do not allow, technically, meaning they can physically put one in if they want to, but the system will not read or write to any media that's stuck in a USB port. And that would be an example of a technical control, and that would be an example of a technical control that we could implement that would help facilitate data loss prevention. Or maybe we have a policy that says USB drives can be put in and data can be read from those devices, but nothing can be written to those flash drives. And there would be a policy, for example, that says, hey, you may not write to any USB devices. But behind that policy, we'd also likely have a technical control that would enforce it so the user is not able to write to that media. In many cases, however, you do not want your computers, your end user computers, being able to read from, in a secure environment, read from a USB drive. And the reason is, if somebody plugs in a USB drive and there's malicious code on that, there's another threat vector or attack vector in which malware could be injected into the computer. Now, with a routine audit, we could also audit the actual computer to find out whether or not they've had USB drives physically inserted into the device. So we may have a policy and technical controls that say we can't read to or write from those devices, but we would also want to verify that that policy is being followed. And in the registry on Windows computers, there is records regarding insertion of various USB media. So the end user, who should not have access to modify or manipulate his or her registry, after inserting a USB drive, the system would have a record in the registry that that drive was inserted, which could be discovered whenever an audit was being done regarding that hardware. So in a secure environment, we'd have the policy that says no USB drives. We'd have technical controls that don't allow the reading or writing. We'd have an acceptable use policy and a security policy that the user would sign every year that would say there's no USB readable, writable devices that you are allowed to plug into your computer. And we'd have an audit periodically just to validate that our controls are in place, that they're still working, and to discover if there's been any breaches of security regarding that policy. I have had a great time, and I'm glad that you joined me for this video. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.